December 14th, 1961. 2:17 a.m. The Flannan Isles, Outer Hebrides. The wind has no direction tonight. It presses from all sides at once, rattling the iron gallery of the lighthouse like a slow, patient knock. Below, the Atlantic doesn't crash, it breathes, long, dark inhalations, slow releases. You can almost feel the cold, salt mist settling into your lungs as the keeper steps back inside and pulls the heavy door shut. The lamp is already turning. Every 12 seconds, the beam sweeps the horizon, white, clean, unwavering, clockwork, faultless. The Fresnel lens hums faintly as it rotates, a sound so constant it has stopped being noise and become atmosphere, like blood in your ears. The keeper removes his gloves and places them on the wooden table. The room smells of oil, damp wool, and old metal. A kettle sits cold on the stove. He does not light it. Instead, he opens the logbook. The pen rests in his fingers longer than usual before it touches the page. For weeks now, the fog has refused to lift. Supply boats haven't docked. No voices over the wireless except clipped confirmations and long stretches of static. The world has narrowed to stone, wind, light, and the slow orbit of duty. Earlier entries in the log are meticulous. Wind speed. Visibility. Barometric pressure. Lamp condition optimal. But tonight something is different. He writes one line, then stops. The pen remains hovering above the paper, ink beads swelling at the tip. His eyes stay on the page, but you sense he isn't searching for words. There's no frustration, no struggle. It's more like the absence of a need. After a moment, he closes the book. No entry for the hour. Outside, the beam continues its sweep, indifferent and precise. Ships will see it, trust it, navigate by it. Somewhere far out in the dark, a captain will adjust his heading by a fraction of a degree because this light tells him it's safe to do so. The keeper does not watch. He sits instead on the narrow cot back against the wall, hands resting loosely in his lap. His breathing slows, sinking unconsciously with the turning lens above him. This is not fatigue. This is not resignation. It is quieter than that. For most of his life, the inner voice had been busy, not loud but constant, measuring, explaining, anticipating. Even here alone on rock and sea, it had continued its work, framing thoughts as if someone else might hear them one day, turning experience into report, feeling into language. But tonight something releases. The voice doesn't argue, doesn't announce its departure. It simply stops asking. From a Jungian perspective, this is not withdrawal from the world. It's a reorganization of psychic energy. A moment when the psyche no longer spends itself on internal performance, no longer narrates itself for an imagined authority, an unseen listener, a future witness. The keeper doesn't think this, of course. There are no concepts forming, no insights crystallizing into sentences. There is only the sense that nothing inside him is waiting anymore. Waiting to be approved. Waiting to be confirmed. Waiting to be translated into something acceptable. You can almost feel the strangeness of it, not dramatic, not euphoric, just unfamiliar, like noticing a background hum has been present your entire life and realizing it has gone silent. He lies back on the cot and stares at the ceiling. The wind shifts again, somewhere metal groans, the lamp continues to turn. Normally, this is where the mind would check itself. Am I doing this right? Is this how I should feel? What does this mean? But none of those questions arrive. There is no inner supervisor stepping forward, no imagined reader of the logbook, no invisible presence to justify the moment too. The keeper sleeps. Hours later, at first light, he wakes without the jolt of urgency that once pulled him from rest. The light is still burning, the mechanism hasn't faltered, nothing has been neglected. He climbs the stairs, inspects the lens, checks the oil feed, all movements precise, practiced, unhurried. When he returns to the logbook, he opens it again. The blank space from the night before remains. He studies it briefly. Then, without ceremony, he turns the page and writes the day's weather conditions in the same steady hand he has always used. No explanation for the gap. No attempt to correct it. It's as if the absence doesn't require defense. And that is the unsettling part. Because the outer world hasn't changed, The rules remain, the light must be kept, the watch must be held, the lighthouse exists for others, not for him. Yet something fundamental has shifted inwardly. A subtle authority has relocated. Not to ego, not to defiance, but to something quieter, something that no longer needs to be witnessed to be real. Most people never notice when this happens. It doesn't announce itself with confidence or rebellion, there's no declaration of independence, no dramatic severing from expectation. It arrives the way silence does when a door closes gently. And if you felt it even briefly, you recognize it not as loss but as weight redistributing inside you. The keeper moves through the day with the same competence as before, but there is a new economy to his inner life. Thoughts arise only when needed. Feelings pass without explanation. There is no internal audience applauding or judging his endurance. By nightfall, the fog thickens again. The lamp turns on schedule. And somewhere between one rotation and the next, the man understands, without thinking it, that nothing inside him is waiting for permission anymore. Not from superiors. Not from tradition. Not even from his own past self. The light does not flicker. But something else has gone dark forever. And that silence will begin to change how everything else is experienced. The second night passes without incident. No storms. No alarms. No missed procedures. And yet something is unmistakably different. The keeper notices it not in what happens, but in what doesn't. Normally, solitude sharpens the mind, thoughts grow louder in the absence of voices, memory becomes theatrical, old conversations replay themselves with improved dialogue, regrets revise their scripts, future explanations rehearse themselves endlessly just in case someone someday asks. But now there is none of that. The mind feels unoccupied, not empty, unassigned. He sits at the small wooden table as dusk settles, eating slowly, tasting the food rather than narrating it. No internal commentary rises to describe the moment. No inner sentence begins with "this means." Outside, the fog presses close, erasing distance. The lighthouse might as well be the only structure left on Earth. And still, there is no urge to account for himself. From a Jungian perspective, this is a rare psychological inflection point. Not a breakthrough, not an awakening, but a withdrawal of psychic energy from an invisible contract most people never realize they've signed. The contract says, be legible, be explainable, be justifiable, be understandable to someone. Even alone, the psyche often continues to perform. It imagines a listener, a judge, a future version of itself looking back and evaluating whether this moment was handled correctly. That inner witness is not conscience. It is not morality. It is an audience. And tonight that audience does not show up. The keeper climbs the spiral stairs with the same steady rhythm, but his body feels heavier in a way that is grounding, not tiring. Each step lands fully. Nothing rushes ahead of him to narrate the climb. At the lantern room, he checks the mechanisms by touch rather than sight. His hands know the machine intimately, every vibration, every subtle resistance. This knowledge has never needed words. The light rotates. The world remains navigable. Down below, the sea is invisible but present. He senses it more than he sees it, a vastness that doesn't require recognition to exist. And that's when the realization brushes past him, not as thought but as orientation. No one is watching. Not in the comforting sense. Not in the frightening one. Just not at all. Most people assume that being unwatched would feel like freedom, or loneliness, or danger. But this feels like neutrality. As if a pressure he had mistaken for gravity has quietly been lifted. He notices something else. When fatigue arrives, it is allowed. When alertness returns, it does so without command. The body regulates itself without consulting an internal authority. There is no internal reprimand for drifting thoughts. No reward for discipline. Action and rest occur because they are appropriate, not because they will be evaluated. This is what makes the shift unsettling. Because without an audience, even virtues change texture. Endurance no longer proves anything. Silence is no longer strategic. Responsibility becomes procedural rather than moralized. The keeper is still reliable, still precise, still utterly dependable. but none of it feels like performance. Later that night, as the beam cuts through the fog once more, he leans against the railing and lets the wind press against his coat. It's cold enough to sting. The kind of cold that usually triggers internal commentary, complaint, comparison, self-talk meant to manage discomfort. There is none. The sensation exists, that's all. You might imagine this would feel hollow. It doesn't. It feels sealed. Like a door has closed somewhere deep inside, not to keep others out, but to keep something from leaking away. Jungian psychology suggests that much of adult psychological tension comes from the psyche's attempt to remain oriented toward others even when no one is present. Energy is spent maintaining a self that can be explained, defended, or admired. When that orientation collapses, the result is not isolation, it is containment. The keeper experiences this containment physically. His posture changes subtly, shoulders settle, breathing deepens without instruction, the chest no longer tightens before nothing. He does not label this calm, he does not romanticize it. There is no one to romanticize it for. And that may be the most disorienting part. Without an audience, meaning no longer accumulates through narrative, it accumulates through continuity. The light turns. The watch holds. The night passes. And inside, something holds as well. A few days later, perhaps 4, perhaps 6, time has softened, he notices the urge to speak has diminished. Not because there is nothing to say, but because speech no longer feels like confirmation. Words, when they arise, are functional, they do not rehearse, they do not echo. If a thought cannot improve reality, it dissolves without resentment. This is not numbness. Feelings still move through him, subtle, unforced, but they don't demand interpretation, they don't petition to be understood. The psyche, freed from its imagined observer, has stopped explaining itself to itself. And once that happens, a strange inversion occurs. The world feels closer. The sound of the wind is sharper, the mechanical hum of the lens more distinct, the weight of the night more specific. Without an inner audience pulling attention inward, perception settles outward, not anxiously but precisely. He becomes less aware of himself and more present. Most people never experience this long enough to trust it. The moment the inner audience falls silent, panic often rushes in to replace it. Who am I if I'm not being witnessed, even by myself? The keeper does not ask this. Not because he has an answer, but because the question no longer has leverage. Identity, for the first time, is not being negotiated. It simply persists. And persistence, it turns out, is quieter than personality. On the 7th night or the 8th, the exact number has lost importance. The keeper pauses mid-step on the stairs. Not from fear. From recognition. Something in him understands that this shift is irreversible. The inner voice that once asked permission is not resting. It has relinquished authority. And whatever comes next will not be shaped for approval, only for necessity. The lighthouse beam sweeps again, cutting a clean path through darkness. But inside the man who tends it, a different kind of visibility has ended. And what replaces it will test him in ways silence never had before. The change becomes undeniable not in crisis, but in routine. Morning arrives with the same pale light filtered through fog and salt haze. The keeper wakes before the clock not out of discipline but because the body is ready. He sits on the edge of the cot for a moment, boots on the floor, hands resting on his knees. There is no internal inventory. No review of the self. No subtle question, am I still the kind of man who does this well? That question used to arrive automatically. It was never loud, never anxious, just a quiet checkpoint embedded deep enough to feel like responsibility rather than doubt. Now it doesn't appear. And in its absence, something fundamental shifts. Identity is no longer being maintained. It is being used. The keeper moves through the morning tasks with the same competence as before, but the experience has lost a certain reflective surface. Actions don't bounce back toward self-evaluation, they go outward into consequence. Oil is measured. The lens is cleaned. The mechanism is checked. Each task completes itself and disappears. There is no lingering residue of pride or self-critique. No aftertaste of this says something about me. From a Jungian perspective, this marks a subtle but profound reorganization. The ego, long accustomed to orienting itself through feedback, imagined or real, has loosened its grip on authorship. The psyche is no longer asking, "What does this mean about who I am?" It is asking nothing at all. And that is what makes the silence feel so absolute. Later that day, the radio crackles to life. A voice from the mainland, routine, procedural, distant. Flannan Light reports status. The keeper lifts the receiver. All systems operational, he says. His voice sounds the same, steady, neutral. But something has changed in how the words leave him. They are not shaped to reassure. Not framed to impress. Not weighted with subtext. They are delivered because they are accurate. Nothing more. The exchange ends, static returns. He replaces the receiver without thinking about how he sounded. That thought never forms. And it's then, standing alone in the small room, that the deeper implication begins to surface. Without an internal audience, even self-image begins to erode. Not collapse. Erode. Slowly, quietly, without drama. The keeper realizes he has not thought about who he is in days. Not as a role. Not as a story. Not as a man being observed, even by memory. The past has loosened its grip. Old moments do not replay themselves for reinterpretation. There is no internal tribunal revisiting decisions, polishing explanations, assigning meaning retroactively. Memory still exists, but it no longer argues. And without that argument, time changes texture. Moments stop stacking into narrative, they spread out evenly weighted. The present grows denser, more self-contained. This is where most people would feel unmoored. When identity stops checking itself, fear often rushes in to take its place. If I am not narrating myself, am I still here? But fear requires an observer. And there is none. The keeper notices something else. Choices feel different. When a decision arises, minor, procedural, mundane, it is made without delay, not impulsively but without rehearsal. There is no internal debate staged for an imagined jury. The psyche no longer needs to convince itself. It acts. This is not confidence. Confidence still performs. This is something colder and far more stable. It is alignment without commentary. That night, the fog thickens until the beam feels almost wasted, swallowed inches from the glass. The keeper stands watching it anyway, not because it matters, but because it's what the body does during this hour. The wind shifts, the tower vibrates. And for the first time since the shift began, a thought does arise. It is brief, unadorned. If no one is watching, what holds me in place? The question doesn't echo. It doesn't demand an answer. It simply passes through. What remains is a sensation, subtle but unmistakable. Weight. Not burden. Mass. The sense that something in him has become denser, more inwardly gravitational. Jungian psychology suggests that when the psyche withdraws energy from outer orientation, approval, recognition, mirroring, that energy does not disappear, it condenses. What forms is not isolation, but an internal center of gravity. The keeper feels it now. In how he stands. In how he breathes. In how little he needs. This density changes how the world meets him. The wind no longer feels adversarial. The sea no longer feels vast in a way that diminishes him, even the isolation loses its edge. Not because he has mastered it, but because it no longer defines him. Identity, stripped of its need to be seen, becomes something closer to infrastructure. Invisible. Essential. Taken for granted. The lighthouse does not think about being a lighthouse. It functions. And function, it turns out, is not less meaningful than story. It is simply quieter. The keeper leans against the cold stone wall and closes his eyes for a moment, not to reflect, not to rest. Just to stand. Inside, there is no commentary on the act. No thought observing the stillness. And in that absence, a deeper realization begins to take shape, not as insight but as inevitability. Once identity stops checking itself, it cannot return to performance without feeling false. The old inner voice, the one that asked permission, that sought confirmation, has not gone silent temporarily. It has been replaced. And whatever now holds the center does not speak in words. It holds in pressure, in continuity, in presence that does not need to be named. The light continues to turn. Ships continue to pass. And somewhere between one sweep and the next, the keeper senses that the world has not become smaller without his inner narration. It has become more exact. And that exactness will soon demand something of him, something no amount of explanation could prepare him for. The demand arrives quietly. Not as an emergency. Not as a test. But as a subtle deviation in routine. On the 10th night, or perhaps the 12th, the counting has loosened. The keeper notices a resistance in the rotation, barely perceptible, a hesitation so slight it would vanish beneath inattention. But attention is what remains when nothing inside is talking. He feels it in his feet first, a fractional pause in the rhythm of the beam. The lens still turns, but not with its usual indifference. He doesn't hurry. He doesn't alert the mainland. He simply moves. Up the stairs. Into the lantern room. Hands already adjusting, checking, listening. There is no surge of anxiety, no internal voice rising to frame the moment as important. This is not courage. Courage imagines fear and proceeds anyway. This is something else. The mechanism reveals a minor fault, nothing dramatic, a bearing wearing unevenly, a correction needed before the resistance grows. The keeper works in silence. Oil on metal. Pressure measured by feel. Time suspended in exactness. And as he works, he notices something extraordinary. The absence of commentary has not made him careless. It has made him precise. There is no distraction of meaning layered over the task, no background narration congratulating or cautioning. Every sensation arrives cleanly, every adjustment lands where it should. The psyche, no longer split between action and observation, has become singular. From a Jungian perspective, this is what happens when the ego stops mediating experience for an imagined audience. The self no longer hovers above the body, interpreting, it settles into it. Action and awareness merge. The bearing seats properly. The rotation smooths out. The light resumes its flawless sweep. The keeper steps back, wipes his hands and waits, not to admire his work but to confirm its effect. The beam holds steady. Only then does he descend the stairs. What surprises him is not relief. It's the lack of aftermath. No internal praise. No reflection on competence. No story forming around what could have gone wrong. The moment completes itself and dissolves. Later, sitting alone with a cup of tea he does not think to savor, the realization lands not as insight but as pressure. Responsibility now feels heavier. Not because it is judged, but because it is unshared. When the inner audience existed, responsibility had an outlet. It could be explained, framed, justified internally. Now there is no one to justify anything to. Failure would not be dramatic. Success would not be celebrated. Both would simply be. This is where the quiet becomes intense. Because without explanation, weight reveals itself as weight. The keeper understands, again without words, that this inner consolidation is not comfort, it is capacity. To hold without narrating. To act without rehearsal. To carry without display. Most people never stay here long. The absence of an inner audience often triggers a frantic reconstruction. New identities are adopted, new performances staged, anything to restore the sense of being seen, even by oneself. But the keeper remains. Not because he is disciplined. Because something in him has become too dense to disperse. The days pass. The fog lifts briefly, then returns. A supply boat appears once distant and brief, then vanishes back into the gray. A voice over the radio asks routine questions. Everything is normal. And yet inside, the center holds. The old reflex to explain himself does not return. And with that absence comes a strange, sobering clarity. If no one is watching, then nothing will intervene. No internal moral theater. No self-concept stepping in to soften impact. Only consequence. Only continuation. Only the exact relationship between action and outcome. This is not freedom. Freedom implies options. This is commitment stripped of ornament. The keeper realizes that whatever he does now, whatever choices he makes in the future, will not be buffered by narrative. They will land directly in reality. And for the first time, that reality feels solid enough to meet him fully. The light turns through the night. And as the beam completes another flawless sweep, the keeper senses that the silence inside him has crossed a threshold. It is no longer just absence. It is load-bearing. And soon it will ask him to stand under it, without explanation, without audience, without retreat. It happens without warning. Not at night. Not during the watch. But in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. The keeper is repairing a weathered section of railing when the wind shifts sharply, sudden and forceful. A misstep, small, almost forgettable, sends a jolt through the metal beneath his hands. For a fraction of a second, balance falters. In the past, that instant would have triggered a cascade. A sharp intake of breath. A spike of internal commentary. A mental replay already forming that was careless. None of it occurs. The body corrects itself. Hands grip, feet adjust, weight redistributes. The moment passes. What lingers is not adrenaline, but recognition. The silence inside him did not hesitate. It did not consult a story. It did not defer to caution framed as self-talk. It acted. And in that action, the keeper understands something that cannot be unlearned. The silence is no longer passive. It is directing. From a Jungian perspective, this marks a crucial shift. What began as the withdrawal of psychic energy from performance has reorganized into an internal authority that operates without language. This is not instinct. Instinct reacts. This is coherence. The psyche, no longer fragmented by the need to observe itself, has become unified enough to lead. The keeper resumes his work without pause, the wind howls then settles, the sea remains unseen but present. And for the first time, he notices that he trusts this inner state more than he ever trusted his thoughts. Thoughts can be persuasive. Stories can be convincing. But this is reliable. That evening, as the light turns on schedule, he stands watching the beam from the lantern room. Fog drifts in loose sheets, illuminated briefly, then erased. The old inner voice, the one that asked permission, that framed experience as something to be evaluated, feels distant now. Not silenced. Obsolete. The keeper senses that if it were to return, it would sound like a stranger interrupting a conversation that has already moved on. Silence, once in absence, has become the organizing principle. It decides when rest is needed, when attention must sharpen, when nothing should be done at all. There is no drama in this authority. No command. Only alignment. This is the kind of inner power that never announces itself. It does not persuade, it does not negotiate. It simply proceeds. Most people confuse this state with detachment. It is. Detachment pulls away. This draws inward. The keeper feels more anchored to the lighthouse than ever before, more present in his body, more exact in his perception. But less invested in what any of it might mean. Meaning has stopped being the currency. Function has taken its place. And function, once internalized, becomes identity without description. Late that night, as the beam completes another rotation, a thought finally forms clearly enough to be noticed. Not a question. A statement. This will not go back. There is no fear attached to it. No relief either. Just certainty. The keeper understands that he could return to the mainland tomorrow and still carry this silence with him. It is no longer dependent on isolation. The audience is gone. And nothing inside him is waiting for it to return. That realization carries a quiet gravity. Because it means that whatever life brings next, connection, conflict, recognition, loss, will meet a self that does not perform. A self that does not ask. A self that does not need to be witnessed to remain intact. The lighthouse beam sweeps again, steady and unremarkable. And in that steadiness, the keeper recognizes the final transformation. Silence is no longer something he endures. It is something that holds him in place. The authority has shifted. And it will shape everything that follows. The days that follow do not feel different. That is what makes the change so complete. Routine continues uninterrupted. The light turns. The watch holds. The weather moves in its indifferent cycles. But the keeper begins to notice something subtle in how time passes through him. Moments no longer lean forward. There is no inner anticipation pulling experience toward what comes next. No silent preparation for explanation, for retelling, for meaning-making later. Each hour stands on its own. Not isolated, finished. This alters how effort feels. Tasks no longer borrow energy from imagined futures. They draw only what they need from the present. When a job is done, it leaves no residue of self-assessment behind. The body rests more deeply. The mind stays quieter longer. Not because it is controlled, but because it is unprovoked. From a Jungian perspective, this is what happens when psychic energy consolidates around an internal center rather than dispersing toward recognition. The psyche stops orbiting potential judgment and begins operating from gravity. The keeper feels that gravity now. In how he walks. In how he stands. In how little explanation accompanies his actions. One afternoon, while scanning the horizon through a break in the fog, he becomes aware of something else. The desire to be understood has not disappeared. It has completed itself. There is no ache attached to it, no frustration, no resentment. It feels like a task that has run its course. For most of his life, being understood, even silently, even hypothetically, had been a background orientation. Thoughts shaped themselves toward clarity, feelings arranged themselves toward coherence. Now they do not arrange at all. They exist. They move. They resolve. And in resolving themselves, they leave him intact. This is when a quiet realization begins to form, not as insight but as implication. If nothing inside him is asking permission anymore, then nothing outside him can grant it. Approval becomes informational, not structural. Disapproval becomes noise. This does not make him defiant. It makes him unavailable. Unavailable to manipulation through praise. Unavailable to correction through shame. Unavailable to identity offered from the outside. He can still listen. But listening no longer rearranges him. That evening, the radio crackles again, a brief message, a routine acknowledgement. The keeper responds with the same measured clarity as always. When the exchange ends, he does not replay it. He does not wonder how he came across. He does not adjust himself afterward. The moment ends cleanly. And it's in that cleanliness that the final shift settles into place. Silence, once something endured, then something carried, has now become something that contains him. It defines the boundaries of his inner life, not by restriction but by completion. There is nothing leaking outward, searching for confirmation. Nothing reaching ahead to secure legitimacy. Nothing looping backward to revise itself. Only presence. Only continuity. Only the exactness of being where he is, doing what must be done without commentary. The keeper stands at the window as night falls again, watching the beam cut through darkness that does not resist it. He understands now that the inner voice did not stop asking permission because it grew stronger. It stopped because it was no longer needed. Authority did not arrive as a voice. It arrived as silence that no longer felt empty. And that silence will follow him long after the fog lifts, long after the watch ends, long after the lighthouse becomes just another structure on a map. Because once permission is no longer asked for, nothing essential can be taken away. The ending does not arrive as a conclusion. There is no final night. No ceremonial handover. No moment where the keeper stands and recognizes this as an ending at all. The lighthouse continues. So does he. Weeks later, perhaps months, the distinction no longer matters. A supply boat finally reaches the island. Boots on stone, voices in the wind, the ordinary disruption of human presence. The keeper listens, answers questions, accepts provisions. Nothing inside him moves to meet the moment. Not withdrawal. Not resistance. Just proportion. The voices feel distant not because they are unwelcome, but because they no longer organize him. One of the men remarks casually, "Must get quiet out here." The keeper nods. He does not explain. There is nothing to explain. Silence is no longer an experience he is having. It is the condition from which he lives. From a Jungian perspective, this is the final consolidation. When the psyche has fully withdrawn from imagined judgment, even language loses its obligation to translate inner life. Words become tools again, not bridges. The keeper walks the men back to the boat. The fog lifts just enough to reveal a narrow horizon. The sea breathes in its slow, ancient rhythm. As the boat pulls away, he watches it recede, not with longing, not with relief. Simply with accuracy. The island returns to itself. That night the lamp turns as it always has. The beam does not hesitate. It does not wonder who sees it. It does not adjust itself based on recognition. It exists to function. And function, carried long enough without explanation, becomes truth. The keeper stands in the lantern room, hands resting lightly on the railing. He feels the familiar weight of the structure beneath his feet, the stone, the metal, the precise geometry of purpose. Something in him mirrors it exactly. He understands now that the inner voice did not stop asking permission because it was silenced. It stopped because it completed its task. The self no longer needs to be authorized to exist. It does not need an audience, internal or external, to stay intact. This is not detachment from the world. It is a deeper agreement with it. To act without narrative. To feel without justification. To be without rehearsal. Most people spend their lives asking quietly, is this allowed? Is this acceptable? Is this who I'm supposed to be? In one night, often unnoticed, that question simply does not arrive. The absence is not loud. But it is permanent. The light sweeps again, carving certainty into darkness that never argues back. Somewhere far out at sea, a ship adjusts its course by a fraction of a degree, trusting a signal whose keeper it will never know. And inside the tower, inside the man, something holds steady without explanation. Not because it is seen, but because it no longer needs to be.